The winter wind drags itself across the old stone monastery, and every breath turns to frost in the dark. Inside a tiny stone cell barely big enough for a bed frame and a prayer, the cold sits heavy, like a creature waiting to steal your warmth. The walls are pure thermal mass. They eat heat 5 times faster than wood. No chimney, no vents, no power grid, just a room built to test a man. At minus 40 degrees, this kind of cold makes you bargain with God. Yet the monks survived it. They slept warm. They endured night after night without choking smoke or burning firewood. So how did they do it? How did they outsmart a winter that could kill a man before dawn? Inside the old monastery, the stone cell looks simple, almost bare, but every wall hides a quiet trick the monks learned the hard way. They built many of these cells with 2 layers of stone, an outer wall thick enough to stop the cloister wind, an inner wall thinner, almost fragile, and between them a narrow band of trapped air, a dead airspace. Not much, just a few inches. But out here in frost-bitten silence, at minus 40 degrees, a few inches can save a man. Stone is pure thermal mass. It steals heat 5 times faster than wood. One touch, and it pulls the warmth right out of your bones. That is why a single-layer wall feels like trying to sleep inside a cave of ice. The monks understood that fire was not the enemy. Heat loss was. So they used air itself like a shield. The idea came from simple observation. Whenever 2 cloaks hung together, the layer of still air between them stayed warmer than the room. If cloth could do, that stone could too. So they shaped their cells carefully. Thick outer stone to face the storm, thin inner stone to hold the shape, air in between to break the cold. No chimney, no vents, no power to help them. Yet that air pocket softened the bite of the night. It slowed the cold. It held radiant heat longer, and it created a tiny microclimate just big enough for one man to survive the vigil hours. Modern jackets work the same way. Your winter coat feels warm because of little pockets of still air, not just the fabric itself. The monks discovered that 1,000 years early. They treated cold like an opponent. And they won by making space for air. They thought the danger was the wind, not the fire. And they were right, but this was only their first layer of defense. When the monks lay down to rest, the stone cell was still a room built to test a man. The floor pulled heat like a hungry beast, and anyone who lay straight on it would lose more than half his warmth before midnight. So the monks built their own microclimate, 1 layer at a time. Their beds always began with rough wooden slats. Just wood, nothing fancy. But wood was already warmer than stone. On top of that went a thick mattress of straw. Not the soft modern kind, but coarse stalks packed tight enough to hold a 5 to 8 centimeter dead airspace. A hidden pocket of warmth. That layer alone slowed the heat loss that usually hits hardest around 3 in the morning. Then came wool. Heavy wool, the kind that smells like earth and lasts for years. They used a wool blanket, then a linen shroud, then another wool cloak pulled tight over the legs. It was a sandwich of insulation. Wood, straw, wool, cloth, more wool, layer after layer designed not to create heat, but to trap the little radiant heat the human body can give. When stacked correctly, those layers turned a freezing stone cell into something close to a shelter. Not comfortable, but survivable. And survivable was all they needed. The payoff was simple. Warm pockets of air under the spine, stable heat around the chest, a deeper sleep without shaking awake in the dark. That is why this old method still beats electric heating during a blackout. It does not rely on the grid. It relies on physics. Modern sleeping bags use the same idea. All warmth comes from trapped air. The monks figured that out 1,000 years early, long before vents, chimneys, or heaters. They knew the cold would steal everything unless they layered smarter, and this was only the beginning of their nightly battle. In the heart of many monasteries, the cold did not just drift along the floor. It hunted through the hallways, cloister winds sliding under stone arches, drafts sharp enough to cut through wool, In a night like that, an open bed was as good as an invitation to freeze. So the monks shaped the very walls around their sleep. They carved small bed alcoves directly into the stone pockets of shelter, only 2 or 3 feet deep. A tiny hollow, a refuge, a space just big enough for one man and his breath. The logic was simple but brilliant. When the room is too big, your body has to heat the entire space. And in a stone cell at -40, that is a losing battle. But shrink the space and the rules change. 3 stone sides, a low ceiling, a wool curtain drawn across the front like a quiet barrier. Suddenly the wind disappears, the cold slows down, and the heat from one human body begins to matter. Even a single monk could warm that small alcove faster than the rest of the cell could drain it away. It created a microclimate, an inner room within the room. The stone still had terrible thermal mass, but inside the alcove, that mass worked for them, not against them. It held a bit of radiant heat instead of swallowing it whole. Many monks said it was the only place where the frostbitten silence of the night could not follow them. The payoff was real. No more drafts clawing at their necks. A stable warmth that lasted longer into the vigil hours. A deeper sleep that carried them through the dark. It is the same principle modern survivalists use when they build sleeping pods inside emergency shelters. Smaller space, less air to heat, more life to keep. Sometimes the smallest space is the safest one. And for the monks, this was only the beginning of their fight against the cold. Inside the stone cell, the cold always went first for the places a man could not protect. The neck, the ears, the scalp where the wind cuts deepest. In a night without chimney heat, that loss was deadly. 30 to 40% of the body's warmth escapes through the head and the back of the neck. The monks learned that lesson early, and they answered it with one of the simplest tools in the entire monastery, a wool cowl, thick, heavy, woven tight like a promise. Every monk owned one. It was the same hood they wore during the vigil hours, pulled low under the stone arch as frost drifted across the cloister. But at night, the cowl became survival gear. They tugged it down to cover the ear's jawline and the vulnerable curve of the neck. Sometimes they tied a linen cloth underneath it, a thin shroud to trap a second layer of still air. Wool on top, linen below, warmth held between them. The effect was immediate. Fast warmth, deep warmth, the kind that settles in the chest and stops the shivering before it starts. In a room built to test a man, that hood was the difference between waking up steady or waking up shaking. It was old, it was simple, and yet it beat most modern sleep hoods because it locked heat where the body loses it fastest. The payoff mattered most at 3 in the morning. That is when heat loss peaks. That is when the frostbitten silence presses hardest against the cell. But with a cowl, the monks kept their core temperature stable long enough to survive until dawn. The principle is still used today by Nordic soldiers and Arctic rescue teams. Cover the head guard, the neck save the body. A simple hood, a 1,000-year-old trick. And this was only one piece of their quiet war against the cold. In a stone cell with no chimney fire was not a comfort. It was a threat. One spark and the smoke would cling to the ceiling, thicken the air, and choke a sleeping man before he ever reached the door. So the monks did something quietly brilliant. They stopped trying to make heat inside the room and started bringing heat in from outside. They learned that large stones, dense, heavy, full of thermal mass, could hold warmth for hours after coming out of the monastery kitchen fire. Long after the embers died, the stones stayed hot. Not blazing, not dangerous, just a slow, steady glow of radiant heat. And in a place where the frost-bitten silence pushed against the walls, every night that glow mattered. Here's how they did it. The kitchen monks heated fist-sized or melon-sized stones near the cooking hearth. When the stones were ready, they wrapped them in thick, coarse wool, just enough to handle without burning fingers. Then they carried them down the cold hallway, past the cloister wind, and into the sleeping cells. Each stone was tucked under a wooden bench or slid beside the straw mattress where the heat could rise gently. The payoff was almost miraculous for a room with no vents and no grid. Slow heat, clean air, no smoke at all. A warm pocket that lasted long enough to bridge the dead hours before dawn. This technique was one of the oldest no-fire heating methods in Europe, used in mountain villages centuries before chimneys became common. Modern Scandinavia still uses the same principle with soapstone heaters, big blocks that hold heat for half a day. The monks had their own version, smaller, simpler, but powerful enough to keep a man alive in a room built to test him. A warm stone, a cold night, and the knowledge that survival sometimes begins outside the fire. Inside a medieval monastery, warmth wasn't just a comfort, it was a rhythm, a shared pulse. The monks lived by a strict cycle prayer, sleep prayer again, moving through the cold nights like a single disciplined body. In a stone cell at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that rhythm became a weapon against the freeze. Because the moment one man opened his door at the wrong hour, the warmth of the entire hallway could spill out, and the cold would sweep in like a blade. They discovered something subtle but powerful: synchronized sleep. When every monk lay down at the same hour, when every cell door stayed shut, when the hall remained still, heat lingered. Not much, but enough. Each room radiated a little warmth into the stone around it, and those stones held that warmth just long enough for the next cycle. A shared microclimate across dozens of tiny rooms. Here's how they kept it stable. The monks slept, woke for the vigil hours, and returned to sleep at almost the exact same minute. Doors stayed closed during the darkest part of the night, when heat loss is most violent. No wandering, no late-night pacing, no unnecessary drafts sliding under the cell doors. A simple rule: move together, rest together, endure together. The payoff was quiet, but life-saving. Less warm air escaping. No sudden temperature shock when stepping out into the hallway. No single cold burst that could drop a man's core temperature before he reached morning prayers. It was discipline, but it was also survival. Modern mining cabins in the Arctic still use a similar principle: synchronized heat schedules, because one person's midnight door swing can chill an entire bunkhouse. The monks already understood this 1,000 years ago. A shared rhythm, a shared warmth, and a reminder that sometimes the strongest insulation is each other. By the time the cloister wind starts crawling under the stone arch, the monks are already gathering for their final prayer of the night. Their breath turns to mist. Their robes hang heavy like a linen shroud. In a cell that feels like a room built to test a man, warmth has to start from the inside, and the monks understood that long before science put a name to it. The problem was simple. A poor body running on thin soup alone can't hold heat through a 40 Celsius night. Not in a stone box with no chimney, no vents, no power grid. Their internal fire would sputter out by 3 a.m., right when the cold claws through the cowl and steals whatever warmth is left. But they made a discovery. Fat burns slow. Fat burns steady. Compared to carbohydrate, it releases a long, radiant heat that doesn't spike and crash. Perfect for a night when heat loss hits its peak. So before the last vigil hours, the monks ate differently. Thick oat porridge, butter, animal fat saved for winter's hardest stretch. Not luxury, fuel. They ate right before the final prayer, letting the warmth of the meal rise from the chest to the hands, building a small internal fire that stone walls couldn't crush. The payoff was real. Warmer cores, deeper sleep. No freezing shock at 3 a.m. Warmer, deeper, safer. Reflection came naturally to them. Sometimes heat doesn't come from the walls. Sometimes it begins with the man himself. Modern survivalists still use the same trick and call it the heat before sleep meal. The monks had no name for it. They just knew it kept them alive. And in a world where one bad night meant frostbite or worse, that quiet wisdom was worth more than any chimney. The candle melts low, its flame trembling against the stone arch, and the monk's breath fades into the dark like drifting smoke. The old wool layers still cling to the body the same way they did 1,000 winters ago. And it reminds us of something simple. We have electricity, gas vents, and thermostats. But the moment they fail, we go right back to the same principles these men lived by. They didn't fight winter, they learned its rhythm. They worked with it. That's why they survived nights that would break most of us today. And if you think these stone cells were cold, wait until you see how the Vikings slept warm in earthen houses during a blizzard.